Section 3 of Farewell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Farewell by Honore de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. Section 3. The prudent magistrate, recognizing the gravity of the crisis through which his friend was passing, refrained from asking questions or exciting him further, and grew impatient of the length of the way to the chateau, for the change wrought in the colonel's face alarmed him. He feared lest the Countess's terrible disease had communicated itself to Philippe's brain. When they reached the avenue at l'Isle-Adam, d'Albon sent the servant for the local doctor, so that the colonel had scarcely been laid in bed before the surgeon was beside him. If Monsieur le Colonel had not been fasting, the shock must have killed him, pronounced the leech. He was overtired, and that saved him. And with a few directions as to the patient's treatment, he went to prepare a composing draught himself. Monsieur de Sucy was better the next morning, but the doctor had insisted on sitting up all night with him. I confess, Monsieur le Marquis, the surgeon said, that I feared for the brain. Monsieur de Sucy has had some very violent shock. He is a man of strong passions, but with his temperament, the first shock decides everything. He will very likely be out of danger tomorrow. The doctor was perfectly right. The next day the patient was allowed to see his friend. "I want you to do something for me, dear d'Albon," Philip said, grasping his friend's hand. "Hasten at once to the Minorite convent, find out everything about the lady whom we saw there, and come back as soon as you can. I shall count the minutes till I see you again." Monsieur d'Albon called for his horse and galloped over to the old monastery. When he reached the gateway, he found someone standing there, a tall, spare man with a kindly face, who answered in the affirmative when he was asked if he lived in the ruined house. Monsieur d'Albon explained his errand. "Why, then, it must have been you, sir, who fired that unlucky shot. You all but killed my poor invalid." "Ah, I fired into the air." "If you had actually hit Madame la Comtesse, you would have done less harm to her." Well, then, we can neither of us complain, for the sight of the Countess all but killed my friend, Monsieur de Sucy." "The Baron de Sucy, is it possible?" cried the doctor, clasping his hands. "Has he been in Russia? Was he in the Beresina?" "Yes," answered d'Albon. "He was taken prisoner by the Cossacks and sent to Siberia. He has not been back in this country a 12-month." "Come in, monsieur," said the other, and he led the way to a drawing-room on the ground floor. Everything in the room showed signs of capricious destruction. Valuable china jars lay in fragments on either side of a clock beneath a glass shade, which had escaped. The silk hangings about the windows were torn to rags, while the muslin curtains were untouched. "You see about you the havoc wrought by a charming being to whom I have dedicated my life. She is my niece, and though medical science is powerless in her case, I hope to restore her to reason, though the method which I am trying is unluckily only possible to the wealthy." Then, Like all who live much alone and daily bear the burden of a heavy trouble, he fell to talk with the magistrate. This is the story that he told, set in order and with the many digressions made by both teller and hearer omitted. When, at 9 o'clock at night, on the 28th of November, 1812, Marshal Victor abandoned the heights of Studzianka, which he had held through the day, he left 1,000 men behind with instructions to protect, till the last possible moment, the 2 pontoon bridges over the Beresina that still held good. This rear guard was to save, if possible, an appalling number of stragglers, so numbed with the cold that they obstinately refused to leave the baggage wagons. The heroism of the generous band was doomed to fail, for unluckily the men who poured down to the eastern bank of the Beresina found carriages, caissons, and all kinds of property which the army had been forced to abandon during its passage on the 27th and 28th days of November. The poor half-frozen wretches, sunk almost to the level of brutes, finding such unhoped-for riches, bivouacked in the deserted space, laid hands on the military stores, improvised huts out of the material, lighted fires with anything that would burn, cut up the carcasses of the horses for food, tore out the linings of the carriages, wrapped themselves in them, and lay down to sleep instead of crossing the Beresina in peace under cover of night. The Beresina that even then had proved by incredible fatality so disastrous to the army. Such apathy on the part of the poor fellows can only be understood by those who remember tramping across those vast deserts of snow, with nothing to quench their thirst but snow, snow for their bed, snow as far as the horizon on every side, and no food but snow, a little frozen beetroot, horseflesh, or a handful of meal. The miserable creatures were dropping down, overcome by hunger, thirst, weariness, and sleep, when they reached the shores of the Beresina and found fuel and fire and victuals, countless wagons and tents, a whole improvised town, in short. The whole village of Studzianka had been removed piecemeal from the heights of the plain, and the very perils and miseries of this dangerous and doleful habitation smiled invitingly to the wayfarers, who beheld no prospect beyond it but the awful Russian deserts. A huge hospice, in short, was erected for 20 hours of existence. Only one thought, the thought of rest, appealed to men weary of life, or rejoicing in unlooked-for comfort. They lay right in the line of fire from the cannon of the Russian left, but to that vast mass of human creatures, a patch upon the snow, sometimes dark, sometimes breaking into flame, the indefatigable grape-shot was but one discomfort the more. For them it was only a storm, and they paid the less attention to the bolts that fell among them, because there were none to strike down there save dying men, the wounded, or perhaps the dead. Stragglers came up in little bands at every moment. These walking corpses instantly separated and wandered begging from fire to fire, and meeting for the most part with refusals, banded themselves together again, and took by force what they could not otherwise obtain. They were deaf to the voices of their officers prophesying death on the morrow, and spent the energy required to cross the swamp in building shelters for the night and preparing a meal that often proved fatal. The coming death no longer seemed an evil, for it gave them an hour of slumber before it came. Hunger and thirst and cold, these were evils, but not death. At last wood and fuel and canvas and shelters failed, and hideous brawls began between destitute latecomers and the rich already in possession of a lodging. The weaker were driven away, until a few last fugitives before the Russian advance were obliged to make their bed in the snow, and lay down to rise no more. Little by little, the mass of half-dead humanity became so dense, so deaf, so torpid, or perhaps it should be said so happy, that Marshal Victor, their heroic defender against 20,000 Russians under Wittgenstein, was actually compelled to cut his way by force through this forest of men, so as to cross the Beresina with the 5,000 heroes whom he was leading to the emperor. The miserable creatures preferred to be trampled and crushed to death, rather than stir from their places, and died without a sound, smiling at the dead ashes of their fires, forgetful of France. Not before 10 o'clock that night did the Duc de Belluno reach the other side of the river. Before committing his men to the pontoon bridges that led to Zembin, he left the fate of the rear guard at Studzianka in Eblé's hands, and to Eblé the survivors of the calamities of the Beresina owed their lives. About midnight, the great general, followed by a courageous officer, came out of his little hut by the bridge, and gazed at the spectacle of this camp between the bank of the Beresina and the Borisov road to Studzianka. The thunder of the Russian cannonade had ceased. Here and there, faces that had nothing human about them were lighted up by countless fires that seemed to grow pale in the glare of the snowfields, and to give no light. Nearly 30,000 wretches, belonging to every nation that Napoleon had hurled upon Russia, lay there hazarding their lives with the indifference of brute beasts. "We have all these to save," the general said to his subordinate. "Tomorrow morning the Russians will be in Studzianka. The moment they come up, we shall have to set fire to the bridge. So pluck up heart, my boy. Make your way out and up yonder through them, and tell General Fournier that he has barely time to evacuate his post and cut his way through to the bridge. As soon as you have seen him set out, follow him down, take some able-bodied men, and set fire to the tents, wagons, caissons, carriages, anything and everything, without pity, and drive these fellows onto the bridge. Compel everything that walks on two legs to take refuge on the other bank. We must set fire to the camp. It is our last resource. If Berthier had let me burn those damned wagons sooner, no lives need have been lost in the river except my poor pontooners, my 50 heroes, who saved the army and will be forgotten." The general passed his hand over his forehead and said no more. He felt that Poland would be his tomb, and foresaw that afterwards no voice would be raised to speak for the noble fellows who had plunged into the stream, into the waters of the Beresina, to drive in the piles for the bridges. And indeed only one of them is living now, or to be more accurate, starving, utterly forgotten in a country village. The brave officer had scarcely gone 100 paces towards Studzianka, when General Eble roused some of his patient pontooners, and began his work of mercy by setting fire to the camp on the side nearest the bridge, so compelling the sleepers to rise and cross the Beresina. Meanwhile the young aide-de-camp, not without difficulty, reached the one wooden house yet left standing in Studzianka. "So the box is pretty full, is it, messmate?" he said to a man whom he found outside. "You will be a knowing fellow if you manage to get inside," the officer returned, without turning round or stopping his occupation of hacking at the woodwork of the house with his sabre. "Philippe, is that you?" cried the aide-de-camp, recognizing the voice of one of his friends. "Yes. Ah, is it you, old fellow?" returned M. de Sucy, looking round at the aide-de-camp, who, like himself, was not more than 23 years old. "I fancied you were on the other side of this confounded river. Do you come to bring us sweetmeats for dessert? You will get a warm welcome," he added, as he tore away a strip of bark from the wood and gave it to his horse by way of fodder. "I am looking for your commandant. General Eble has sent me to tell him to file off to Zembin. You have only just time to cut your way through that mass of dead men. As soon as you get through, I am going to set fire to the place to make them move." "You almost make me feel warm. Your news has put me in a fever. I have 2 friends to bring through. Oh, but for those marmots, I should have been dead before now, old fellow. On their account I am taking care of my horse instead of eating him. But have you a crust about you, for pity's sake? It is 30 hours since I have stowed any victuals. I have been fighting like a madman to keep up a little warmth in my body, and what courage I have left. Poor Philippe! I have nothing, not a scrap. But is your general in there? Don't attempt to go in. The barn is full of our wounded. Go up a bit higher, and you will see a sort of pigsty to the right. That is where the general is. Good-bye, my dear fellow. If ever we meet again in a quadrille in a ballroom in Paris." He did not finish the sentence, for the treachery of the northeast wind that whistled about them froze Major Philippe's lips, and the aide-de-camp kept moving for fear of being frostbitten. Silence soon prevailed, scarcely broken by the groans of the wounded in the barn, or the stifled sounds made by M. de Sucy's horse crunching on the frozen bark with famished eagerness. Philippe thrust his sabre into the sheath, caught at the bridle of the precious animal that he had managed to keep for so long, and drew her away from the miserable fodder that she was bolting with apparent relish. "Come along, Bichette, come along. It lies with you now, my beauty, to save Stephanie's life. There, wait a little longer, and they will let us lie down and die, no doubt." And Philippe, wrapped in a pelisse, to which doubtless he owed his life and energies, began to run, stamping his feet on the frozen snow to keep them warm. He was scarce 500 paces away before he saw a great fire blazing on the spot where he had left his carriage that morning with an old soldier to guard it. A dreadful misgiving seized upon him. Many a man under the influence of a powerful feeling during the retreat summoned up energy for his friend's sake when he would not have exerted himself to save his own life. So it was with Philippe. He soon neared a hollow where he had left a carriage sheltered from the cannonade, a carriage that held a young woman, his playmate in childhood, dearer to him than anyone else on earth. End of Section 3. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.